You are standing in a small, smoky hall somewhere in the English countryside, in the year 1086. The winter air creeps in through the cracks in the wooden walls, and in the dim light of a tallow candle, a man with ink-stained fingers bends over a wax tablet. His name is not recorded, though his work will echo for 1,000 years. He is one of many royal clerks, sent out under orders from King William I, the man known now as William the Conqueror, to perform one of the most ambitious and painstaking acts of record-keeping in medieval Europe. It is called the Domesday Survey, and it is, in a sense, England's first national inventory. This was no small matter. England in 1086 was not yet the polished kingdom of later centuries. It was a quilt of counties, baronies, and small manors, still scarred by the Norman invasion of 20 years earlier. Fields were still burned in the north from William's brutal harrying of the north. Many villages had not fully recovered from the famine that followed. But the new king wanted something other rulers rarely demanded: a full accounting of what his realm contained, who owned it, and what it was worth. You can imagine the endless trudging of the royal commissioners. Men in long woolen cloaks, carrying scrolls and quills, crossing muddy roads, pausing in market squares, and summoning villagers to swear oaths. They gathered around makeshift tables, listening as landowners listed every acre, every ox, every mill, and every pig. The clerks asked, in precise formulaic Latin, quotus carucatae terrae ibi sunt, how many ploughlands are there? They recorded the answers with careful brevity. There was no room for narrative or embellishment. Each entry was a fragment of the kingdom's bones. Yet within that dull enumeration lies something quietly magnificent. The pulse of a medieval economy frozen in words. Each shire was surveyed by royal command, and the results sent to Winchester, where scribes would compile them into what became known as the Domesday Book, the Book of Judgment. The name came later, from the sense that, like the Last Judgment, its verdicts could not be appealed. If the Domesday Book said your estate contained 2 mills and 40 sheep, then so it was, for all legal and taxation purposes. No arguments, no exceptions. But what, exactly, prompted such a massive bureaucratic undertaking? On the surface, it was taxation. William wanted to know what revenues his new kingdom could produce, especially as he contemplated the possibility of invasion from Denmark. But the deeper truth was about control, about knowing, in excruciating detail, who owed him what. England under William was a land of feudal pledges and divided loyalties. Norman lords had been granted estates that once belonged to Anglo-Saxon nobles. Yet confusion lingered, boundaries overlapped, records were missing, and local customs varied wildly. The Domesday Survey aimed to fix all of that. To pin the shifting world of medieval property to parchment. For the people being recorded, the villeins, bordars, and serfs who tilled the fields, the survey was an event both fearful and distant. Many of them never saw the Domesday clerks at all. They were represented by their lords, who swore oaths on their behalf. But in the minds of villagers, the royal inquiry had a shadow of divine awe about it. To be counted by the king was to be noticed by God's representative on earth. And to be omitted was, perhaps, even more frightening a sign of irrelevance. Picture, for a moment, the manor of Houghton, or Emley, or any of the thousands of small entries that fill the Domesday folios. A small community of 50 or so souls, a church of rough stone, a watermill by a stream, and a lord who owed allegiance to a greater baron. The land was measured not in acres, but in ploughlands. How much could be tilled by one team of 8 oxen in a year? A manor with 3 ploughlands might have room for 3 teams, 2 owned by the lord, 1 by his tenants. The survey recorded all of it, even the fish ponds, the meadows, the woodlands, the number of hives. In Dominio, sunt duo carucae. In Demesne, are 2 ploughs. Ibi sex villani et quatuor bordari, cumuno caruca. There are 6 villagers and 4 smallholders with 1 plough. Dry words, but beneath them lives the slow grind of ploughs, the creak of wooden wheels, the dull rhythm of medieval survival. It's worth pausing on the method of the survey, because it was a marvel of administration for its time. Commissioners were organised by regions, each responsible for a circuit of counties. They were instructed to gather local juries, half Norman, half English, and to extract sworn testimony about every holding. These testimonies were then cross-checked against previous records from Edward the Confessor's reign. The questions followed a rigid template. Who held the land in the time of King Edward? Who holds it now? How many hides of land? How many men? How much woodland? How many animals? What is it worth? What was it worth before 1066? By modern standards, it was repetitive, even tedious. But that monotony was its strength. Every manor was measured by the same unbending logic. In the end, nearly every part of England south of the Tees was captured in the survey. No other medieval kingdom attempted anything of comparable scope until centuries later. You can imagine the scribes in Winchester, the royal capital, hunched over parchment, their quills scratching in rhythm as they compiled regional returns into the great volumes. The work was not beautiful, but it was deliberate. The handwriting of the Domesday Book is firm and regular. Its Latin terse, but exact. There were no illustrations, no embellishments, only the relentless listing of facts. It was as though the kingdom itself had been flattened into a table of contents. To those who served in William's court, the book was both a marvel and a weapon. The king now possessed a tool of surveillance unprecedented in medieval Europe. If a dispute arose over land or tax, the Domesday Record settled it. It was the ultimate reference, the final word, as it is written in the book. For the peasants who lived beneath that gaze, however, the results could be quietly suffocating. Every recorded ox or acre meant another layer of responsibility, another obligation calculated, another rent justified. The Domesday Book was, in its way, the beginning of England's long tradition of bureaucracy, a web of parchment that bound the land tighter than any army could. And yet, the most curious thing about the Domesday Book is what it leaves out. It does not record people's names below the rank of freeholder. It does not describe the weather, the crops, the laughter in the taverns, or the grief in the churches. It is a world without faces, a census of assets, not souls. The peasants who lived and died in those villages remain anonymous, their existence acknowledged only by the count of the Lord's livestock. The document is both an act of order and an act of forgetting. Still, through its silences, historians have reconstructed much of daily life from its numbers. The average manor in Domesday England probably had about 400 acres of arable land. Most peasants had a single ox, sometimes shared among neighbours to make a full plough team. Woodland was vital for pigs and firewood, meadows for hay, and mills for grinding grain, all of which the survey noted with unfailing precision. From this, we can almost see the rhythms of medieval rural existence. The slow rotation of crops, the clatter of millstones, the cycle of sowing and harvest. Every entry, though brief, hints at endurance of people who worked the same soil year after year, tethered to routines that outlasted kings. In this way, the Domesday Book captures something far more profound than an economic statement. It reveals the structure of power, not just who ruled, but how they knew they ruled. To count a kingdom was to claim it. William's conquest of England began with swords, but ended with ink. The Domesday Book was, in essence, the conquest's ledger, the final accounting of who possessed what after 2 decades of upheaval. And for all its meticulousness, the Domesday Survey was finished in astonishing speed, likely less than a year. By August 1086, the final assembly at Salisbury saw all the landholders swear allegiance to the king. effectively binding the new order in law and record. The book was then placed in the royal treasury, rarely to be opened, except in matters of dispute. It sat, quietly, as England changed around it through the Angevins, the Plantagenets, and beyond its pages, growing darker with the dust of centuries. The Domesday Book still survives. More than 900 years later, its parchment browned, and its ink faded, but legible. When you see it now in the British Library, it seems almost small. 2 volumes, one called Great Domesday, the other Little Domesday. But within them lies the entire map of Norman England, in words, an empire reduced to columns and clauses. It is a strange thought that one of the most important monuments of the Middle Ages is not a cathedral, not a castle, but a book of taxes. And so, as the winter of 1086 deepened, and the royal scribes sealed the final pages, England itself was transformed from a conquered land into a counted one, a nation measured, classified, and declared. The men who made it did not know they were shaping history. They were merely following orders, asking questions, and writing answers. But one might still wonder, what became of those countless voices behind the ink, the villagers, reeves, and smallholders who were counted, taxed, and forgotten? How did their quiet, daily labour sustain the kingdom that now recorded them so coldly? It is the early spring of 1087, and the ink of the Domesday Book is barely dry. In the royal treasury at Winchester, clerks have stacked the great volumes on a wooden table, each bound in rough leather, smelling faintly of wax and smoke. Outside, the wind rolls across the Hampshire fields, carrying with it the sound of distant bells. Within these walls, the kingdom exists twice, once in the living world of villages and harvests, and once in the static perfection of parchment. This was William's New England, measured, recorded, and judged. You can almost hear the soft rasp of parchment when a clerk opens the book. Inside, each county follows a strict format, shire by shire, hundred by hundred, manor by manor. There is no narrative flow, no ornament, only the stern repetition of formula. The king holds, the earl holds, the abbot holds. These phrases repeat endlessly, like the tolling of a bell through the centuries. The scribes did not write for poetry, they wrote for permanence. Every word was an act of authority. I, the world according to Winchester. To understand what the Domesday Book meant, you must imagine how rare written documentation was in the 11th century. Most people lived and died without seeing a single written word. The royal scribes were a breed apart, literate in Latin, trained in the Benedictine monasteries, their fingers calloused by years of writing charters and copying psalters. When they wrote Terra est una hida, the land is one hide, they were translating the messy reality of the English countryside into an abstract legal order. But the hide itself was not a fixed measure. It could vary wildly, sometimes 60 acres, sometimes 120, depending on the fertility of the land. In the Domesday Book, the hide became a fiscal concept, a unit of taxation, not geography. One hide was the amount of land required to support one household, or, more importantly, to yield £1 of tax to the king. Through such definitions, England was not just described, it was redefined. Behind the numbers lay an immense administrative machinery. The sheriff of each county acted as the king's local agent, summoning juries of 12 men, half Norman, half English, to give sworn testimony. These jurors were often weary farmers, pulled from their ploughs, now forced to remember details. Who owned what, how much it produced, and what it had been worth 20 years before. Their testimonies were recorded by travelling commissioners who carried wax tablets and portable writing kits. They worked slowly, methodically, and often in uncomfortable conditions. The weather could be cruel, the roads muddy, and the inns full. Yet they pressed on, Because the king's survey did not wait for the seasons. Each commissioner carried royal authority, but also suspicion. There were penalties for false testimony, and disputes could drag on for weeks. When the data returned to Winchester, the scribes there had to reconcile contradictory statements. They wrote carefully, using Latin shorthand and precise symbols to save space. Errors were dangerous. A single misplaced word could mean the loss of a manor or the gain of a fortune. So they worked late into the night, candles sputtering in the thick air, their lips moving as they read each line aloud before setting it to ink. IR, a kingdom of numbers and names. The Domesday Book lists roughly 13,418 places, spread across 34 counties. It records about 270,000 households, though household is an elastic word, encompassing lords, peasants, and even slaves. To modern historians, the figures reveal that England's population in 1086 was probably around 1.5 to 2 million people, a small number by modern standards, yet one of the most densely settled regions in Northern Europe at the time. The book also provides a unique picture of land distribution. More than half of England's land was owned by fewer than 200 Norman barons, all of whom held it directly from the king. Among them, William's half-brother, Odo of Bayeux, stood out. His holdings stretched across 23 counties, making him one of the richest men in Europe. But even Odo's power existed only because the king permitted it. Below the great lords were layers of subtenants, knights, and freeholders who owed military service in exchange for land. Below them, the peasants, whose obligations were measured in days of labour, bushels of grain, or the maintenance of the local mill. The Domesday Book captured all this, but it did so with an almost chilling detachment. The human world became arithmetic. For instance, in the entry for Ely Abbey, one reads, "In Demene are 10 ploughs, and among the men 14 ploughs. There are 32 villagers, 16 smallholders, and 4 slaves. Meadow for 10 ploughs, woodland for 100 pigs, pasture for 200 sheep." There is no mention of names or lives, yet in these numbers lies the faint echo of a community, its labour divided, its animals counted, its world confined to the boundaries of a manor. Even more fascinating is how values were recorded. Each manor was given 3 figures: its worth in the time of King Edward the Confessor, before 1066, its worth when the new Norman owner received it, and its current worth in 1086. These comparisons reveal much about the impact of conquest. Some manors doubled in value under Norman management, thanks to new organisation or fortifications. Others collapsed, especially in the north, where William's brutal campaigns had devastated the land. In Yorkshire, vast tracts were marked simply as waste uninhabitable, untaxed, their value reduced to nothing. It is in those blank spaces, more than the written ones, that you sense the human cost of empire. The politics of paper. The Domesday Book was not just an administrative exercise, it was a political act of consolidation. William had conquered England 2 decades earlier, but conquest alone did not guarantee loyalty. Barons were growing restless, and rumours of Danish invasion still circulated. The survey served as both a practical tool and a reminder. Every lord, every manor, every ox belonged ultimately to the crown. To be recorded in the Domesday Book was to be acknowledged by royal authority. To be omitted was to risk erasure both legally and symbolically. This subtle control extended even to the clergy. Monasteries that had once enjoyed autonomy under Anglo-Saxon kings now found their lands redefined and their revenues remeasured. The church was powerful, but in the Domesday Book, even abbots and bishops stood as tenants of the king. One of the survey's most remarkable consequences came at the Oath of Salisbury in August 1086. There, William gathered his major landholders and knights in one vast assembly, perhaps the largest in Norman England's history. Each man swore direct allegiance to the king, bypassing their immediate lords. It was a stroke of administrative genius, the first written expression of a principle that would define English monarchy for centuries, that loyalty flowed not through feudal intermediaries, but directly to the sovereign. And all of it, ultimately, began with a book, IV, Daily Life, beneath the ledger. For the people of the villages, the real subjects of this vast bureaucratic experiment, life went on, much as before. A villain still owed 3 days of labour a week to his lord's demesne. A bordar still tended his small patch of vegetables. A cotter still helped maintain the hedges and fences. The Domesday Book did not change their routines, but it formalised their position in an unbreakable hierarchy. The peasants may not have understood Latin, but they understood consequences. To be in the book meant that your obligations could be proved, enforced, and taxed. To be out of the book might mean that your land could be claimed by another. Still, there was a peculiar stability in being known. In a world where famine, war, and disease could erase a village overnight, being listed in the king's record was, in a way, a form of immortality. Each entry brief, as it was ensured that the name of a place would endure long after its inhabitants were gone. Hundreds of villages mentioned in Domesday have since disappeared, swallowed by time, plague, or enclosure. Yet their names live on in those inked lines, the last trace of their existence. The book did not preserve their stories, but it preserved their outlines, and perhaps that was enough. The legacy of the ledger. By the time William died later that same year, in September 1087, the Domesday Book was already functioning as a cornerstone of royal administration. His son, William Rufus, inherited both the crown and the archive. In disputes over land, royal officials consulted the book as if it were scripture. Its authority became unquestioned. To contradict its entries was to defy the king's own word. Centuries later, monarchs like Henry II and Edward I still used the Domesday Book as a legal reference. Even during the 13th century, when England's bureaucracy had expanded into a labyrinth of rolls and charters, the Domesday Book remained the original document of record, the purest statement of royal ownership. In its quiet, bureaucratic way, it laid the foundation for the English state, not through drama or conquest, but through lists, totals, and the quiet endurance of ink. Today, when historians study the Domesday Book, they marvel less at what it contains than at what it represents: the birth of government as paperwork, the belief that order could be achieved through documentation. It is perhaps the least romantic, most enduring legacy of the Norman conquest, that England became a nation ruled by record-keeping. And yet, for all its precision, one mystery remains. The Domesday Book was never fully completed. Some counties were left out, others only partially surveyed. There is no surviving copy of the original royal order commissioning it, and the exact methods by which it was compiled are still debated. It is a book that tells us everything and nothing. Perhaps that is why it feels so haunting. Because behind every neat line of Latin lies a life we will never fully know. And behind every carefully ruled column of ink lies a silence that no record can capture. In the centuries that followed William's conquest, the Domesday Book slumbered in the royal treasury like an artifact of divine authority, consulted rarely, copied occasionally, but never forgotten. It had become something more than a document. It was the kingdom itself, bound in leather and ink. When you imagine it now, try not to see a museum piece or a relic under glass. Instead, picture it as it existed in the 12th century, lying on a table in Winchester, its pages heavy, its script tight and brown, with age even then. The clerk who opened it would do, so carefully, as if disturbing a sacred object. The pages did not flutter like modern paper. They resisted movement, thick and waxy, from the calfskin parchment. The ink iron gall had bitten deep into the fibres, leaving each letter permanently scarred into the hide. And across those pages stretched the empire of William's imagination, a kingdom frozen at the moment of its own definition. I. The Quiet Centuries. After William's death, the Domesday Book remained in Winchester, then later in Westminster, where it was kept in a wooden chest bound with iron. The royal clerks who guarded it were among the few men in England who ever touched it. They called it simply the Book, as if there were no other. It was consulted in moments of dispute, often when a landholder claimed rights that others denied. A sheriff, unsure of an ancient boundary, might request to see the record. The Royal Exchequer, calculating taxes, might verify old holdings. But the book's real power was psychological. To cite the Domesday Book was to invoke an authority beyond question. It was final. By the 13th century, England's administrative world had grown more complex. There were now rolls for taxes, rolls for court proceedings, rolls for charters, rolls for debts. Scribes filled entire halls with parchment. But the Domesday Book still retained an aura of ancient judgment. The very name Domesday, derived from the word doom, suggested that its verdicts were eternal. In an age that saw kings rise and fall, wars fought and treaties broken, there was comfort in knowing that one thing remained constant. The book neither grew nor decayed. It did not bend to the will of politics. It simply existed, unchanged, while everything around it shifted. The rediscovery of forgotten names. Centuries passed. New kings ruled. Henrys, Edwards, and Richards. The Black Death swept through England, killing half its people. Whole villages vanished, their ploughlands reverting to wilderness. Yet the Domesday Book remained, quietly preserving their names. When the plague had passed and England began to rebuild, scribes and clerks once again turned to the old record to understand what had been lost. It told them of lands now desolate, of manors that had fallen into ruin. A clerk in the 14th century, reading its lines, might pause at an entry like, "In Southmood, 3 villani, 2 bordari, and 1 mill." But there was no longer a Southmood. Its people were gone. Its fields overgrown. The name survived only because of ink pressed onto calfskin 3 centuries before. In that sense, the Domesday Book became a kind of memorial, not to the powerful, but to the ordinary, to the invisible rhythm of rural life that had once filled England with quiet labour. Even as new layers of governance appeared, parliaments, courts, royal charters, the book's shadow persisted. Every new record owed something to it, the belief that governance required counting, classification, documentation. The medieval mind had accepted that salvation could be written down. Now it accepted that so could property. The scholars of ink and dust. By the time of the Tudors, England had changed beyond recognition. The monasteries were dissolved, the feudal world collapsing into a market one. The Latin of the Domesday Book had grown opaque to most readers. The handwriting, compact, abbreviated, strange, seemed to belong to another civilization, but there were always a few who could read it. In 1530, a royal antiquary named John Leland sought the book in the treasury at Westminster. He found it covered in dust, its clasps rusted, but still intact. He described it reverently as a monument of no small antiquity. Later, under Elizabeth I, scholars began to study it in earnest. They transcribed portions by hand, copying the crabbed letters, line by line. It was slow work a single county might take weeks to reproduce. The language was studied like scripture, its abbreviations decoded, its formulas compared. What those scholars found was not drama, but pattern, the repetitive hum of an ordered society, and in that monotony they found meaning. A record of people who had endured conquest, taxation, famine, and yet had continued to plough their fields, tend their animals, and count their measures of grain. The Domesday Book, in its unchanging quietness, had outlasted the men who made it, the kings who owned it, and the empires that succeeded them. IV. The Modern Awakening. When England entered the modern age, the Domesday Book entered it too. In 1861, it was officially rebound, its pages cleaned and conserved. For the first time, it became accessible to the public. Scholars, genealogists, and curious amateurs came to study it, tracing the outlines of medieval England like an archaeologist brushing dust from ancient bones. It was then that historians began to realize just how revolutionary it had been. The idea of a state survey of counting every property, every person, every animal, had no precedent in Europe. The Romans had taken censuses, yes, but none had survived in such detail. The Carolingian kings of France had kept records, but scattered and inconsistent. Only William's England had attempted such an all-encompassing catalogue, and had succeeded. Modern scholars saw in it the origins of something familiar: the modern bureaucratic state. When a government today conducts a census, or when a nation measures its wealth in ledgers and databases, it is echoing the logic of the Domesday Survey. The methods have changed, quills replaced by keyboards, but the impulse is the same: to know a realm by counting it. And so, the book that once measured oxen and hides now sits in the British Library, digitized and searchable. Its data still relevant to archaeologists, historians, and linguists. It has become one of the oldest surviving databases in the world. Yet, even in digital form, its tone has not softened. It remains austere, factual, unyielding. It is the voice of administration stripped of emotion, of history told without sympathy. V. The silence between the lines. If you look closely at one of its pages, the thick, yellowed parchment under sterile light, you might notice the tiny irregularities, the faint, dark spots where the ink has pooled, the indentations from a quill pressed too hard. These are the fingerprints of the scribes, preserved for 9 centuries. It is tempting to think of them as anonymous, but perhaps that is too easy. They were real men, each with a name, though none recorded it. They paused between sentences to wipe their eyes, to stretch cramped fingers, to warm wax near the flame. Their work was not glorious. It was tedious, repetitive, mechanical, yet it built the backbone of a kingdom. History often remembers kings and warriors, but the Domesday Book reminds us that civilization also rests on the shoulders of clerks, the quiet architects of continuity. Even the word bureaucracy, so often spoken with disdain, has its roots in such rooms, in the slow, careful labor of people who believed that order could be achieved through ink and attention. And perhaps they were right. For the book they wrote still survives, long after the castles have fallen to ruin. VI. Reflections across 1,000 years. It has been nearly a millennium since William's commissioners trudged through the muddy lanes of England, counting oxen and fields. The world has changed utterly. The ploughlands have become suburbs, the manors, housing estates, the villages, cities. Yet the principle endures: the belief that knowledge confers authority, that to measure is to rule. Governments today conduct censuses, collect taxes, and maintain databases of every citizen. The tools are different, but the logic is the same. We are all, in one way or another, living inside new versions of the Domesday Book, recorded, categorized, known. The original book, resting quietly in its case in London, feels strangely alive in that realization. Its pages, once used to bind feudal England, now speak to the modern world in whispers of data and documentation. It reminds us that civilization depends not only on creativity or courage, but also on patience, on the endless, unseen work of counting, writing, and remembering. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of William's Great Survey: that history's most enduring monuments are not always towers or tombs, but the quiet, methodical records of human effort. So the Domesday Book endures silent, patient, eternal. Its scribes long turned to dust, its villages vanished, its lords forgotten, Yet through it, an entire world still breathes the echo of England as it once was, seen through the eyes of clerks who sought only to describe, not to dramatize. And in their dry precision lies something unexpectedly human, a longing to understand the vast and shifting world by setting it down, one word, one figure, one ploughland at a time. The year is 1173, and winter lies heavy across England. The fields are bare, the rivers sluggish with ice, and in a remote castle somewhere in the south, Eleanor of Aquitaine, once the most powerful woman in Europe, sits alone beside a dying fire. The guards change shifts outside her chamber door, with the dull clatter of chainmail. Somewhere down the corridor, a servant's steps echo on cold stone. The Queen, nearly 50 at the time, listens without moving. She has been listening for months to the muffled rhythm of her confinement, to the silence of her absent sons, to the slow, relentless passage of another English winter. For 15 years, Eleanor had ruled beside her husband, Henry II of England, King of England, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, and lord of vast territories that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. They were, together, the architects of a continental empire. But in the spring of 1173, that empire cracked from within. Eleanor's sons, Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, had rebelled against their father, and the Queen, proud, ambitious, and weary of Henry's dominance, had encouraged them. Now she was a prisoner. A queen. Without a court, Eleanor's imprisonment was not announced publicly. Henry was too shrewd for that. He understood that humiliating his wife would draw sympathy from her powerful allies in Aquitaine and France. Instead, he kept her under discreet house arrest, moving her quietly from one castle to another, Winchester, Salisbury, Sarum, and others. Her conditions were comfortable, but confined. She was given attendance, allowed books, embroidery, and letters, though each was inspected by royal agents before reaching her hands. She was permitted to walk the castle grounds, but only under guard. To the outside world, she had simply retired from court life. But those who had known her, the brilliant, commanding Duchess of Aquitaine, once the patron of troubadours and the muse of poets, would have found the silence astonishing. Before her marriage to Henry, Eleanor had been Queen of France, wife to Louis VII. She had ridden across the burning plains of Anatolia during the Second Crusade, commanded her own vassals, and inspired songs in every court from Poitiers to Paris. She was not made for stillness, yet now she lived in a world reduced to stone walls, iron locks, and the occasional rustle of parchment. Letters, through the lattice. It was through letters that Eleanor tried to keep her mind alive. She had always been a writer of letters precise, elegant, and strategic. Her correspondence was political, of course, but also deeply personal. In her captivity, the act of writing became a form of resistance. A letter, even one inspected and censored, was a small assertion of presence. She wrote to her daughters, who had been married into royal courts across Europe. Matilda, in Saxony, Eleanor, in Castile, and Joan, in Sicily. These daughters carried her name, her education, and her diplomatic instinct. Through them, she tried to sustain her influence, to remind the world that the Queen of England was still thinking, still remembering. The letters that survive from her later life show her remarkable clarity of tone. There is no self-pity, only control. When she writes to the Pope, she is courteous but firm. When she writes to her sons, she alternates between affection and rebuke. We do not know exactly what she wrote during these first years of imprisonment, but we can imagine the careful rhythm of her script, the way the quill must have sounded against parchment in the stillness of her room, the ink slowly darkening as she paused to find the right word. Each letter, once sealed with wax, became a small defiance, a voice slipping past the walls. I, the empire beyond the walls. While Eleanor waited, Henry ruled. The rebellion of 1173, 1174, was crushed with remarkable efficiency. His sons, lacking coordination, surrendered one by one. Foreign allies withdrew, and when the smoke cleared, Henry's empire remained intact. But victory came at a cost. The rebellion had revealed deep fractures within his family and among his barons. Distrust lingered everywhere, and behind it all was the quiet spectre of the imprisoned queen, unspoken, unseen, yet impossible to forget. Henry's courtiers rarely mentioned her in official documents. Chroniclers refer to her obliquely as the queen who is confined. But her absence was felt. The court lost its warmth, its sense of culture and ceremony. Henry was a man of law and logic, not poetry. Eleanor had been the court's soul, the one who balanced intellect with charm, authority with grace. Now, even banquets felt cold. The troubadours who had once performed for her in Poitiers found themselves unwelcome in England. The court became an engine of governance, stripped of art. Yet beyond England, Eleanor's influence persisted. In Aquitaine, her homeland, nobles still invoked her name. In France, her ex-husband's descendants watched the situation closely. And in Rome, the papal curia received whispers that Henry's household was fractured, a sign of divine displeasure. It is strange to think how much power can survive in absence. Eleanor's silence became a kind of presence of its own, the invisible centre of Europe's gossip and speculation. IV. The shape of captivity. We know surprisingly little about Eleanor's daily life during those long years, but what records we do have suggest a rhythm of quiet endurance. She rose early. The castles where she was kept were old and draughty, their fireplaces inadequate. Servants would bring heated stones to warm her bed before dawn. Her morning prayers were said in a small oratory adjoining her chamber. Breakfast, if one can call it that, was simple: bread, ale, perhaps a bit of cheese or fruit when available. The royal kitchens were efficient but plain. Her meals were served alone, occasionally with one or two attendants. Much of her day was spent reading or dictating letters. Latin and French texts filled her shelves. Psalters, histories, romances. She had always valued learning. In her youth, she had patronized poets like Bernard de Ventadorn. Now, in captivity, she reread his verses as memories of a freer time. Occasionally, she was permitted visitors, clerics, messengers, or sometimes even members of Henry's household. Each meeting was an exercise in restraint. Every word might be reported. Every gesture could be misinterpreted. Even so, she maintained her composure. Chroniclers note that she aged with dignity, her wit undiminished. It is difficult, from the modern world, to grasp what that kind of waiting feels like. Suspension of time, the repetition of seasons. Yet for Eleanor, patience was not passivity. She understood that history moved slowly, and that those who endured long enough might outlast their conquerors. V. The turning of the seasons year after year. She waited. Winters passed in monotonous grey. Summers brought no change. Henry visited occasionally, though not out of affection. These meetings were formal, even tense. He allowed her limited correspondence with their sons, but ensured that every word passed through his own clerks. Outside the castle walls, England was changing. Roads improved, markets grew, and new monasteries rose from the countryside. Henry's legal reforms, the foundations of the English common law, took shape during this time. Ironically, as he built a system based on justice and order, he continued to imprison his wife without trial. By the early 1182s, his sons were men grown, each restless, each ambitious. Richard, in particular, had inherited his mother's pride and independence. As Duke of Aquitaine, he ruled her former lands with fire and sword, quelling rebellions, commanding loyalty through force as much as charisma. Eleanor heard of these deeds through letters, proud of him, perhaps, but also fearful. She knew too well how ambition could consume families. Still, she waited. The chronicles grow quiet during these years, as if even the scribes had grown weary of noting her confinement. But silence in medieval history is never meaningless. It is the space between lines that tells us what could not be said aloud. V.I. The world narrowed to a room. By her mid-50s, Eleanor had spent nearly a decade in captivity. Her hair had turned silver. Her hands, once accustomed to reins and jewels, had grown thin and pale. Yet her mind remained sharp. She occupied herself with the small rituals of governance as much as she was allowed. She kept track of her lands in Aquitaine through reports smuggled by loyal clerks. She distributed small alms to nearby abbeys. She read the Psalms daily, finding in their rhythm a mirror of her own endurance. Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord. It must have been strange for her, a woman who had once moved armies and shaped kingdoms, to live in such stillness, and yet there was a certain dignity in it, the calm of someone who understood that her time would come again. Because power, she knew, is not only exercised in action, it is also preserved in memory, in the way others continue to speak your name, even when you cannot speak for yourself. The winter before the thaw. By 1183, Henry's once mighty empire was crumbling. His sons were again in rebellion, this time led by Richard, with the support of the French king. Henry the young king had died the same year, leaving a bitter void in the family. Eleanor, still imprisoned, received the news quietly. Chroniclers record no reaction, but one can imagine her grief, the ache of a mother who had outlived a child she could not even mourn in public. Perhaps, in that winter, she began to sense the shift of fortune. Henry was aging, worn by war and betrayal. His authority waned, and somewhere beyond the castle walls, her name began to stir again in the whispers of Europe. The queen who had waited so long was not forgotten. Now, as another winter's frost crept across her window, Eleanor may have looked out over the grey fields and wondered how history would remember her. As a rebel, a queen, a mother, or simply as a woman who endured, who held her dignity when the world sought to silence her. The answer, of course, would come soon enough. But in that moment, in that long, quiet winter, she could not yet know that freedom was approaching, and with it, her return to power. Henry had grown tired, not just from the endless rebellions of his sons, but from the grinding weight of empire. In his final years, his body had begun to fail him. The sharp intelligence that once terrified barons now faltered under illness and grief. When news reached him that his son Richard had allied with Philip II of France against him, Henry's heart broke. And when he discovered that even his youngest son, John, had joined Richard's side, something inside him seemed to die before his body did. In early July of 1189, Henry lay dying near Chinon, in France. Among his last acts was an order that surprised nearly everyone at court. He ordered the release of Queen Eleanor. We do not know his reasons with certainty. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was pragmatism, knowing that Richard, now his heir, would demand her freedom. Or perhaps, as some chroniclers suggest, he simply no longer had the will to oppose her. Whatever the reason, the order was carried out. And so, after 16 long years of confinement, the doors opened at last. I too, the return to light. Eleanor's release was not marked by ceremony. No trumpets announced her freedom. No banners flew. A royal messenger arrived, handed her the king's order, and waited as she gathered her things, a few books, a small chest of letters, and a golden crucifix she had carried since youth. Outside, the wind smelled of grass and open fields. For the first time in years, she was free to walk beyond the walls. Those who saw her then described her as aged, but unbowed her back straight, her face composed. The years of captivity had silvered her hair, but her eyes remained sharp, commanding. She had not been broken. She had been tempered. Within weeks, she rode south toward Winchester. The countryside stirred as she passed. Peasants lined the roads to see her. The queen who had vanished and returned again. Some bowed, some simply stared, uncertain whether they were seeing a ghost or a legend. The chronicler Ralph of Diceto wrote, almost in awe, "The Lady Eleanor, once confined, rode forth with the dignity of one who had never been absent. I, the new king and the old queen." By the time she reached Winchester, Henry was dead. Richard was now king. Richard I, later known to legend as the Lionheart. His first act as king was to entrust his mother with the governance of the realm. While he prepared for his crusade to the Holy Land, he named Eleanor regent in all my dominions. She was to oversee the coronation, secure the succession, and ensure the stability of England in his absence. It was a staggering reversal of fortune. The woman who had once been a prisoner of state was now the guardian of the kingdom itself, and she stepped into the role with the same calm authority that had once made her the most formidable duchess in Europe. IV, the Queen in motion. In the months following Henry's death, Eleanor travelled tirelessly across England. She was nearly 70 years old, yet she rode long days through dust and rain, summoning sheriffs, lords, and bishops to her councils. Her first task was securing Richard's rule. There were still pockets of loyalty to the late king, and some feared that the realm might fall into confusion. Eleanor's presence dispelled those doubts. She moved through the land like a symbol of renewal, not as a conqueror, but as the embodiment of continuity. At Winchester, she opened the royal treasury to finance her son's coronation. At Westminster, she oversaw the logistics of the ceremony itself. The robes, the feasts, the oaths. When Richard was crowned in September 1189, it was Eleanor who walked before him, carrying the crown of the Queens of England. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden noted that her bearing was such that none might doubt she had been born to rule. It is one of history's quieter miracles that a woman who had been locked away for nearly 2 decades could return to power so seamlessly, as though time itself had paused in deference to her will. V. The letters of a regent. Once Richard departed for the Holy Land in 1190, Eleanor's responsibilities deepened. She became, in effect, the acting monarch of England. From her seat at Winchester and later at Poitiers, she managed royal finances, mediated disputes, corresponded with foreign rulers, and handled petitions from across the realm. Her letters from this period survive in remarkable number, and they reveal the precision of her mind. She writes to the Archbishop of Rouen about taxes, to the Count of Toulouse about border disputes, and to her daughter in Castile about marriage alliances. Her tone is never emotional. It is measured, legalistic, often weary, but always clear. In one surviving letter, she writes, "I am old, yet I do not rest. I labour for the good of the realm, for the peace of my son, and for the souls of those who have gone before." Her secretaries wrote in the fine, flowing hand of the Angevin Chancery, but the voice is unmistakably hers, pragmatic, proud, and relentless. In her correspondence with Richard, she sometimes slips from formality into affection, calling him "my dear son," "light of my age." But always, the subtext remains the same. She is the keeper of his kingdom, the steward of his legacy. V. Shadows of the past. Yet freedom, even royal freedom, is never without its ghosts. Eleanor had been released, but she lived surrounded by the consequences of those lost years. Her husband was dead, one son gone, and another estranged. Only Richard remained truly close to her, though even that relationship was complicated by distance and duty. When word reached her that Richard had been captured in Germany on his return from the Crusade in 1192, Eleanor once again became the centre of Europe's attention. She raised the enormous ransom required for his release, some 150,000 marks of silver, a sum equal to several years of England's entire revenue. She organised the collection personally, travelling from abbey to abbey, urging bishops and barons to contribute. Even the clergy melted church plate to raise the sum. When the money was ready, it was Eleanor herself who carried it across the Channel. At 70 years old, she crossed into the cold lands of the Rhine to negotiate directly with Emperor Henry VI. Chroniclers wrote with admiration and disbelief. It was unheard of for a woman of her age, much less a queen mother, to undertake such a journey. Yet she did it, calmly, efficiently, without complaint. When she finally met her son in captivity, the reunion was said to be deeply emotional, the first time they had seen one another in years. But even then, she spoke not of sentiment, but of duty. "You must come home, my son," she told him. "Your people wait for you." The 7. The Queen's last campaigns. After Richard's release and return in 1194, Eleanor resumed her regency briefly while he restored order to his dominions. But her life was far from quiet. In her 70s, she continued to travel between England and Aquitaine, resolving disputes, arranging marriages, and managing estates. Her stamina astonished her contemporaries. One chronicler wrote, "Almost in awe, she rode more miles in her age than many knights in their youth." Her final years were spent largely in the service of peace, particularly between her surviving sons, Richard and John. When Richard died in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt during a siege in France, it was Eleanor who stood once again at the centre of history. She was nearly 80, yet she rode to Anjou to secure John's succession. She persuaded barons, negotiated treaties, and stabilized a kingdom on the edge of chaos. She had begun her life as a duchess in a world ruled by men, and she would end it as the matriarch of dynasties. 8. The weight of time. By 1202, Eleanor had retired to the Abbey of Fontevraud, the resting place of her husband and sons. But even retirement did not mean stillness. Letters continued to arrive. Ambassadors continued to seek her counsel. She was regarded, across Europe, as a living relic of an earlier age. A woman who had known 2 kings of France, 2 kings of England, and a line of princes who had reshaped Christendom. Her apartments at Fontevraud were simple: a bed, a writing table, a crucifix. She rose each morning for Mass, then walked slowly through the cloisters, speaking quietly with the nuns. Visitors described her as serene, almost luminous in her old age. The storms of her life had passed, and what remained was a calm endurance, the peace that comes not from victory, but from survival. And perhaps, as she looked across the quiet gardens, she thought of the long years of confinement and of the strange symmetry of fate. She had once been locked away behind castle walls, and now she had chosen these cloisters freely, another kind of enclosure, but this time one filled with peace. Eleanor would live until 1204, dying at roughly 82 years of age. By then, she had outlived all but 2 of her 10 children. Her tomb at Fontevraud lies beside those of Henry II and Richard the Lionheart. She is carved not in mourning, but in serenity, holding an open book upon her chest, as though still reading, still thinking, even in death. The book is fitting. Her life had been a kind of text written in rebellion, captivity, and resilience. And like all good books, it was one that could not be closed until the last page had been turned. Yet even here, her story does not quite end. For her descendants would shape the future of Europe, kings of England and France, queens of Castile and Germany, each carrying, in some quiet way, the legacy of the woman who had once ruled from a cell. What does it mean, then, to endure power without freedom? To wait so long, that waiting itself becomes strength. Perhaps Eleanor of Aquitaine's greatest triumph was not her rebellion, nor her regency, but her patience, the long, silent art of outlasting history itself. When Eleanor of Aquitaine died in 1204, at the Abbey of Fontevraud, Europe felt the quiet passing of an age. The news spread slowly, first among monks, then along the roads that led to Poitiers, Bordeaux, Rouen, and London. Chroniclers wrote with a kind of hushed awe, noting not only her age but her endurance. She had lived through the reigns of 2 French kings, 2 English kings, 2 crusades, and more than half a century of political storms. Few figures in medieval history had seen so much or survived so long, in a world where power was fragile and mortality constant. Yet Eleanor's death was not simply the end of a life. It was the conclusion of a long, deliberate act of legacy, a weaving of family, politics, and memory that would shape the next 3 centuries of European history. The stones of Fontevraud. The Abbey of Fontevraud lies in a valley of soft light, where the rivers Vienne and Loire meet. Even today, the air there feels still the kind of stillness that carries the sound of bells across distance. It was an unusual monastery for its time. Founded in the early 12th century by Robert of Arbrissel, it was designed as a double monastery, men and women living in separate quarters, under the authority of a female abbess. Eleanor, ever drawn to strength in women, admired this place deeply. In her final years, she had chosen Fontevraud as both her retreat and her family's resting place. Her husband, Henry II, was buried there, as was her beloved son, Richard I. Later, their effigies would be laid side by side. Henry with his hands folded in prayer, Richard with a sword resting along his body, and Eleanor with a book open in her hands. That last detail, the open book, is perhaps the most revealing. It was not the symbol of devotion one might expect, but of wisdom and study. Even in stone, she appears to be reading, still engaged, still thoughtful. The monks who buried her recorded few words, only that the Queen was placed beside the kings she had raised. But that quiet phrase contains multitudes. She had not only lived among kings, but made them. 2. The empire she left behind. At the time of her death, Eleanor's lineage stretched across Europe. Her daughter, Eleanor of Castile, was Queen of Castile and mother to Blanche of Castile, who would become the regent of France and mother to Louis IX. Saint Louis, one of the most famous kings in European history. Her daughter Matilda had ruled in Saxony, her descendants intertwining with the princes of the Holy Roman Empire. Through these lines, Eleanor's blood ran through almost every royal house in Western Europe by the 13th century. In a very real sense, she became the matriarch of medieval Christendom. Her legacy was not merely biological, however, it was ideological. Eleanor had embodied a model of queenship that was both intellectual and political. A woman who could govern, command, and correspond with kings and popes as an equal. The courts of her descendants, particularly in France, would echo her influence. The courtly culture of poetry, chivalry, and refined manners that blossomed in the 13th century, often called the Age of Courtesy, had its roots in the salons and courts she had fostered decades earlier in Aquitaine. What had begun as a handful of troubadours singing in her halls became a continental language of love, diplomacy, and art. The silent power of letters. If one could gather all the letters Eleanor ever sent to her sons, her daughters, her clerics, and her enemies, they would form a map of Europe's political heartbeat between 1,150 and 1,200. Her correspondence reveals something remarkable, a world of connection, held together not by armies, but by words. It was through letters that she negotiated marriages, reconciled enemies, and offered advice that spanned kingdoms. In an age when literacy was rare, especially among women, Eleanor treated the written word as her instrument of rule. Each seal she pressed into wax was a gesture of authority, Each letter carried her voice farther than any army could travel. Even today, the fragments that survive in archives in London, Paris, and Rome show her mind at work. Terse, careful, commanding. 1. Written in Latin to the Pope during her son's captivity, ends with a phrase both humble and assertive. I am but a mother, yet I carry the burdens of kings. It is a line that captures her life perfectly. A queen who understood that influence was not always exercised in public, but in the patient shaping of events from behind the scenes. Ivy. The transformation of queenship before Eleanor. Queens were often defined by their marriages, silent companions, mothers of heirs, patrons of monasteries. After Eleanor, the model of a queen changed. She had shown that a woman could govern, correspond, and even command armies. Her life created a precedent that would echo through later generations of royal women. Isabella of France, Blanche of Castile, Elizabeth I, and even Catherine de' Medici would draw, consciously or not, upon her example. And yet, Eleanor's power was not revolutionary in the modern sense. She did not overthrow the patriarchal order. She mastered it. She worked within its constraints so effectively that her authority seemed natural, a quality of birth rather than defiance. That subtlety is what made her influence so enduring. Rebellion fades, legitimacy endures. When later chroniclers wrote of her, they rarely called her rebellious. Instead, they called her nobilissima femina, the noblest of women. Even her enemies, who once condemned her for ambition, came to admire her for perseverance. In a world that measured worth by endurance, Eleanor had become immortal through patience. V. The Quiet of Fontevraud. It is said that, in her final months, Eleanor spent her days near the Abbey Gardens. The Loire Valley was mild in spring, the kind of soft, golden light that flattens the time. She would sit beneath the arches, listening to the bells, watching the shadows shift along the cloisters. Her attendants reported that she spoke little, but listened intently when the abbess read from the Psalms. Occasionally, she would ask for news from Poitiers or Castile. She no longer gave orders. She asked questions about crops, trade routes, and the health of her grandchildren. Even in stillness, she was thinking in terms of governance, of continuity. The nuns of Fontevraud later said that she died peacefully, her hands resting upon her book, her eyes closed as if in meditation. No chronicler recorded her final words, but perhaps she did not need any. Her life had been one long declaration, written across the maps of Europe. VI. The afterlife of a legend. In the centuries that followed, Eleanor's story drifted between fact and myth. Poets turned her into a symbol of romance and rebellion. Historians reduced her to a political footnote. Dramatists made her a heroine of intrigue. Each age reshaped her according to its own imagination. In the 19th century, she was romanticized as the queen of chivalry, presiding over courts of love. In the 20th, she was reimagined as a proto-feminist figure, a woman of intellect and independence in a man's world. The truth lies somewhere quieter. She was neither idealized nor rebellious, but pragmatic, a ruler who endured captivity, betrayal, and loss without surrendering her composure. She was not interested in symbols. She was interested in survival. And yet, that very realism became her legend. Because what could be more enduring, more quietly magnificent, than a life built on patience, intellect, and unbroken will? 7. The legacy in blood and memory. The Plantagenet dynasty, which Eleanor helped found, would rule England for more than 3 centuries. Its kings from Richard the Lionheart to Edward III traced not only their lineage, but their political temperament to her. The fusion of French culture and English administration that defined the Middle Ages began in her generation. Her descendants sat on the thrones of England, France, Castile, Portugal, and Germany. Through intermarriage, the blood of Aquitaine became the bloodstream of Europe. Even centuries later, the echoes of her diplomacy shaped royal policy. The fragile balance of power between England and France, the tension that would one day erupt into the Hundred Years' War, had its roots in the empire Eleanor and Henry built, and in the marriages she orchestrated. In that sense, her influence extended far beyond her lifetime. The maps of medieval Europe still bear her fingerprints, not in cities or monuments, but in borders, treaties, and the quiet persistence of her name. 8. The final reflection. If you were to visit Fontevraud today, you would find her tomb in the cool half-light of the Abbey Church. The stone is pale, worn smooth by centuries of visitors. Henry lies beside her, Richard beyond him, the eternal trinity of the Angevin age. And there she is, the Queen with the open book, her face calm, her gaze directed upward. Visitors often remark on her expression neither stern nor sorrowful, but peaceful, almost amused. It is as if she knows something the rest of us do not. That power, fame, and rebellion all fade, but endurance remains. To look upon her effigy is to be reminded that history is not made only by warriors and kings. It is also made by those who wait, those who hold their place through years of uncertainty until time itself bends in their favour. Eleanor of Aquitaine waited 16 years in silence, and when she spoke again, the world listened. Her story, then, is not one of conquest or glory, but of endurance, the slow, steady heartbeat of power that survives the fall of dynasties. And as the centuries turned, her legacy became less about what she ruled and more about how she ruled, with patience, intellect, and the telement, quiet certainty that time would one day remember her. When the bells of Paris tolled in the spring of 1226, the city stood still. The king was dead. Louis VIII, called the Lion, had ruled for barely 3 years before illness took him during his return from war in the south. He left behind a fragile kingdom, a divided court, and a 12-year-old heir. That heir, Louis IX, would one day become Saint Louis of France. But in that moment, he was a child surrounded by wolves, and standing between him and ruin was his mother, Blanche of Castile. The Spanish Princess Blanche had been born in 1188, the granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her mother, Eleanor of England, had been married to the King of Castile, and Blanche was raised in the dry brilliance of the Iberian court, among poets, priests, and warriors who spoke 3 languages and prayed in 4. She was educated not only in scripture and politics, but in survival. For the Castilian court was a place where kingdoms could shift overnight, where alliances were inked in morning light and broken before vespers. When she was 12, her grandmother Eleanor, already an old woman, undertook one last journey across the Pyrenees to escort her to France. The purpose? To marry Prince Louis, the heir to the French throne. Eleanor had chosen Blanche over her sisters, calling her the most thoughtful. She was right. The Queen in mourning. When Louis VIII died, Blanche was 38 and suddenly regent of France. Few believed she could hold the throne. The barons whispered. The English smiled. Even the Pope hesitated to back her. But Blanche did not weep. She gathered her son and the royal council in the Cathedral of Reims, placed the crown upon the boy's head herself, and declared, "By the grace of God, the kingdom of France shall not fall while I live." It was not a boast, it was a prophecy. Within weeks, revolts flared across the realm. Powerful lords, notably the counts of Champagne, Brittany, and La Marche, rose against her, claiming that a woman could not rule. Her response was astonishing. She rode out in armour. The chroniclers describe her a slender figure, veiled but mounted, carrying the Oriflamme banner of France appearing at the gates of rebellious towns, her son beside her. She did not fight, but she appeared, and that was enough. One by one, the rebellions faltered. The nobles who had mocked her found their armies hesitating in the face of her calm authority. In less than 2 years, Blanche had restored royal power, not through blood, but through presence. Aye. The young king and his mother Louis IX grew into one of the most pious kings in medieval Europe. But his character, his sense of justice, patience, and humility was not born from divine inspiration. It was taught, day by day, by Blanche. She trained him not only in the arts of war and law, but in moral restraint. When he was crowned, she reportedly told, "Rather would I see you dead at my feet than stained by mortal sin." Her love was fierce, almost ascetic, a love that demanded discipline. She surrounded him with theologians, scholars, and monks. She vetted his tutors and even his friends, and when he came of age, she did not retreat from power. Instead, she shared it. For much of his reign, Blanche continued to govern as co-regent, particularly during Louis's crusades abroad. She oversaw taxes, diplomacy, and justice quietly, efficiently, and with an authority that startled foreign ambassadors. In many ways, she was the first modern administrator of the French monarchy, replacing feudal instinct with bureaucratic intelligence. IV. The Queen as strategist. Unlike her grandmother, Eleanor, Blanche rarely rebelled. Her gift was in subtlety. She ruled through control of information, through letters and networks of trust. She knew which abbot could sway a papal envoy, which knight could silence a rumor. Her household was said to be the most disciplined in Europe. Servants rose before dawn, scribes copied laws by candlelight. The royal seal was guarded like a relic. Even her political enemies respected her efficiency. One chronicler wrote, grudgingly, "She had the heart of a man in the body of a woman, and the patience of both." Blanche's Spain-born dignity and French restraint combined into something new, a form of power that felt both natural and inevitable. By the 1230s, no one questioned her rule. France was stable, wealthy, and respected abroad. And Blanche, who had once been dismissed as a foreign princess, now governed as the quiet center of an empire. The shadow between them. For all their closeness, there was tension between mother and son. Louis, as he matured, grew restless under her shadow. He longed to assert himself, to lead armies, to fulfill the role of a Christian king. Blanche, protective to the end, feared that such ambitions would undo him. When he took the cross in 1248 and departed for the Seventh Crusade, she tried to dissuade him, but Louis was resolute. At his departure, she said simply, "Go, my son. I shall see you again, in this world or the next." For the next 6 years, Blanche ruled France alone once more. While Louis struggled in Egypt, captured, ransomed, and nearly dead, Blanche held the realm together. It was a repetition of her earlier regency, but with deeper weariness. The letters she sent to her son during this time are filled with restraint, encouragement, laced with exhaustion. When she finally died in 1252, still governing in his absence, the kingdom scarcely noticed the transition. She had trained her officials so well that France ran like a well-wound clock. Her passing was as quiet as her power had been. VI. The legacy of a mother. When Louis returned from the crusade and learned of her death, he wept openly. He built chapels in her memory and often spoke of her as his true guide. Under his reign, France reached a moral and administrative height unmatched in the medieval world. And at the heart of it, invisible, uncredited, but indelible, was Blanche. She had turned the idea of motherhood into a political principle, nurturing as governance, discipline as devotion. Her model would echo in later queens in Margaret of Anjou, Catherine de' Medici, and even Marie de' Medici, all of whom ruled as mothers first, monarchs second. But Blanche's legacy is not only dynastic, it is architectural. The monasteries, universities, and libraries she founded became part of France's spiritual infrastructure. Where Eleanor had ruled through letters and lineage, Blanche ruled through memory. the building of institutions that would outlast her bloodline. 7. The candle at Saint-Denis. Her tomb lies in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the necropolis of French kings. There, in the shadow of coloured glass, her effigy rests serene, modest, hands folded in prayer. Visitors often pass her tomb without realizing they are in the presence of one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. There is no armor, no crown, no open book like Eleanor's, only simplicity. And yet, perhaps that is fitting. Blanche's strength was quiet, her reign invisible. Her light was not a flame that dazzled, but a candle that endured steady, unwavering, guiding her son, and through him, an entire age. The whisper of legacy. If Eleanor of Aquitaine was the voice of her time, commanding, poetic, alive, then Blanche of Castile was its silence, deliberate, steady, enduring. The two women, grandmother and granddaughter, formed the invisible spine of medieval Europe. One built empires with words, the other preserved them with patience. Together, they made the idea of queenship something Europe would never forget, and somewhere, perhaps, in the echo of cathedral bells, the whisper of their voices still lingers. A grandmother who crossed mountains for a child, and a daughter who ruled a kingdom for her son. The North Sea wind is sharp in the early 11th century, a wind that smells of salt, peat, and something older still. In that wind, a small ship rocks on the waves, its sails half torn. Inside, huddled in wool cloaks, is a family fleeing the collapse of their world. Among them is a child Margaret, daughter of the exiled Anglo-Saxon prince Edward the Atheling. It is the year 1057. England is no longer England. The old royal line of Alfred and Ethelred has fallen. And from across the Channel, William of Normandy has set his eyes upon the throne. The little girl who shivers on that boat does not yet know she will one day wear a crown herself, nor that her reign, gentle, pious, and exacting, will quietly civilize one of Europe's most rugged kingdoms. A lost inheritance. Margaret's lineage was ancient. She was born to the House of Wessex, the same blood that had resisted Vikings, united shires, and forged the English crown. But that crown, so fiercely won, was lost before she came of age. Her father, Edward, had been sent into exile in Hungary during the Danish invasions of England. It was there, far from home, that Margaret was born, likely around 1045, among foreign courts that spoke Latin and Magyar. Hungary was strange to her, but it gave her a rare education. While most Anglo-Saxon noblewomen learned little beyond prayer and household management, Margaret studied scripture, languages, and the theology of the Eastern Church. She learned to read the Latin Vulgate and even some Greek skills that later astonished the Scottish clergy. When her father was recalled to England by King Edward the Confessor in 1057, the family set out for their ancestral home. But Edward the Atheling died within weeks of their arrival. His death left his children, Margaret, her brother Edgar, and their younger sister Christina, adrift in a dangerous world. Soon after, the Norman conquest destroyed what remained of their claim. When William the Conqueror seized the throne in 1066, Margaret and her family fled north, first to the coast, then across the border into Scotland, seeking refuge from the storm of invasion. They arrived at the court of King Malcolm III, a man twice Margaret's age, broad of frame and rough in manner. It was a collision of worlds. The warrior king of the Highlands and the delicate, exiled princess from the south. 2. The reluctant bride. Margaret never intended to marry. Her wish, as later chroniclers wrote, was to enter a convent and devote her life to prayer. But Malcolm saw in her not only beauty, but the possibility of legitimacy, a union that could bind his rough-hewn kingdom to the prestige of the old English line. He courted her earnestly, though awkwardly. He spoke little Latin, less French, and no Greek. She, for her part, spoke softly and preferred study to banquets. but there was sincerity in his admiration. After months of persuasion and, perhaps, a nudge from her family, Margaret agreed. Around 1070, she was crowned Queen of Scots in the Abbey of Dunfermline. The ceremony was modest by continental standards. There were no silks or golden circlets from Rome. The church was bare stone. The crown, a simple band of silver. Yet in that moment, a new chapter of Scotland began. For Margaret, though reluctant, would transform her adopted home more profoundly than any warrior before her. 3. A kingdom of contrasts. Scotland in the 11th century was a world divided. The lowlands spoke a tongue close to English. The highlands, Gaelic. The Isles, Norse. The church was loosely organised, its priests often married, its rites coloured by old Celtic traditions. Malcolm ruled by strength of arms rather than law. Feuds were settled by sword, justice by retaliation. Even the royal court was itinerant, moving between fortresses, more war camp than palace. Margaret found it bewildering. The manners of the Highland lords, their feasting, their rough laughter, their casual brutality struck her as almost pagan. But she did not retreat. Instead, she observed quietly, spoke gently, and began to reform not by decree, but by example. IV. The Queen's Table chroniclers describe her daily routine with reverence. Each morning began before dawn with prayer. She read from the Psalms, fasted often, and attended several masses a day during Lent. But her piety was not distant or cold. She believed faith must be lived. Every day, before she ate her own meal, she served food to the poor. Sometimes hundreds of them, washing their feet in imitation of Christ. Malcolm, unable to match her discipline, often stood by, smiling awkwardly, watching as she ladled broth into wooden bowls. He could neither read nor write, but he loved to hold her books, bound in jewelled leather, and would kiss them with rough, soldierly devotion. The contrast between them, the scholar and the warrior, became the heart of her legend. He, the strength of the realm. She, its conscience. V. Reform and renewal. Margaret saw that the Scottish Church, though ancient, lacked the structure of the Roman one. Many priests married. Fasting days were irregular. The Mass was said in local dialects rather than Latin. Gently, and with tact, she began to encourage reform. She convened councils with bishops and abbots, asking questions rather than issuing orders. Why? She would say, does our Lord's resurrection not hold the same feast day here? As in Rome, bit by bit, she brought the Scottish Church into alignment with continental practice, standardizing the liturgy, restoring proper observance of Lent and Easter, and encouraging the building of monasteries under the Benedictine rule. She also reformed the customs of court life. Nobles were encouraged to wash before meals, to moderate their feasting, to attend Mass regularly. Her influence reached even to dress. Linen replaced coarse wool at court, and imported cloth began to appear, not for vanity, but for dignity. Margaret's reforms were not radical. They were rhythmic, gradual, and deeply personal. Her changes did not come as royal commands, but as habits slowly adopted by imitation. VI. A family of saints and swords. Margaret bore 8 children, 6 sons and 2 daughters. All survived infancy, an almost miraculous feat for the time. Each child was educated carefully. The boys taught both warfare and scripture. The girls raised in charity and study. Her sons would become kings, bishops, and patrons of the church. Her daughter Matilda would later marry Henry I of England, uniting the Norman and Anglo-Saxon lines. A bridge Margaret could never have imagined when she first fled the south. Her household became a school of virtue and learning. Monks, scribes, and travellers from the continent found welcome there. Even Malcolm's soldiers softened under her influence, for she required that discipline in the field matched devotion at home. It was said that Dunfermline under Margaret's rule, was the most peaceful place in the kingdom. The Seven, the balance of strength. Yet not all was gentle harmony. Her reforms were met with resistance, especially from the Gaelic clergy, who saw her as an outsider imposing foreign customs. Whispers spread that she sought to make Scotland too English, that she looked southward rather than to its own roots. Even Malcolm, devoted as he was, sometimes bristled at her austerity. He ruled by instinct, she by reflection. And though he respected her faith, he could not always understand it. Still, he deferred to her in most matters of the church, even when he disagreed. Their marriage, though not equal in power, was equal in devotion, a partnership built on patience. Margaret never sought to dominate him. Instead, she guided not with orders, but with presence, and in that balance lay her genius. The vision of a different kingdom. In the evenings, when the torches burned low and the sounds of feasting had faded, Margaret would sit by the chapel window, reading from the Psalms by candlelight. Outside, the wind swept across the firth, carrying the smell of peat and sea. She dreamed not of conquest or glory, but of peace, of a Scotland that could be known not only for warriors, but for wisdom. It was a distant vision, almost fragile, but she began, one reform at a time, to make it real. A rebuilt abbey at Dunfermline, a scriptorium where monks copied books in clean Latin, a council where Gaelic and Latin clergy debated side by side, a palace where generosity was as respected as valour. From the rough edges of a warrior kingdom, Margaret was shaping something new, a land where prayer and policy could coexist, where power might kneel beside piety. And yet, peace, like all things in that age, was fragile. Beyond the walls of Dunfermline, unrest simmered. Malcolm's campaigns in Northumbria grew more reckless. Enemies stirred to the south and within his own borders. Margaret's reforms, gentle as they were, could not shield her from the realities of kingship. She had tamed the court, but the world outside remained wild, and soon that wildness would return to claim everything she had built. Malcolm had always been a man of action. He had won his throne through violence, overthrowing Macbeth and seizing power in a Scotland still fractured by rival clans and northern raiders. Margaret's peace, though comforting, was foreign to him. He would sit through her councils, nodding absently while clerks debated the date of Easter or the Latin of the Mass. But when the talk turned to borders to the old English lands of Northumbria, his eyes would sharpen, for Malcolm believed those lands were his by right. They had long been disputed between England and Scotland, their people owing fealty to both kings in alternating years, depending on who sent, soldiers first. Margaret, ever patient, would remind him, peace builds more than battle. But Malcolm could not ignore the raids along the border, the taunts of Norman lords, who called him a barbarian king. The clash between them was not of affection, for they loved each other deeply, but of vision. Margaret's world was one of scripture and order, Malcolm's of honour and retaliation. And as the years passed, the call of war grew louder. Aye, the borderlands burn. By the late 1072, England was firmly in Norman hands. William the Conqueror, ever wary of rebellion from the north, fortified his border castles, Durham, Newcastle, Carlisle. To the Normans, the Scots were unruly neighbours. To Malcolm, they were intruders. He began to lead raids across the border, not full invasions, but burning forays into Northumbria and Cumbria. The English villages were poor, their people half Norse, half Anglo-Saxon, kin to Margaret's own blood. The irony was cruel. Her husband's men burned the same lands her ancestors had ruled. Margaret, horrified, tried to temper his fury. She sent envoys to Durham to negotiate truces, offered food to refugees who fled the border fires, but the rhythm of retaliation was relentless. Each raid invited another. The chroniclers describe her praying through the night, fasting for the souls of the slain English and Scottish alike. To her, the war was not a matter of borders, but of sin. The saint in the hall. Even as war shadowed the realm, the royal household remained a model of order. Margaret refused to let chaos undo the peace she had built within her walls. Each morning began with Mass. Each evening ended with reading and reflection. Her servants were expected to attend prayers. Her children were expected to learn their psalms. To visitors, the court seemed almost monastic. Even Malcolm softened in her presence. He would listen quietly as she read aloud from the Gospels, though he understood little of the Latin. Sometimes he would interrupt with a soldier's practicality. "Does this book tell us how to win wars?" And she would answer gently, "It tells us how to end them." Yet, despite her gentleness, Margaret was no naive dreamer. She understood that her husband's strength secured her peace, that his rough justice kept the lords in line. What she sought was balance, a kingdom where sword and scripture might coexist without devouring each other. IV. The King's Pilgrimage. In 1093, when Margaret was approaching 50, Malcolm announced his intention to march south once again, this time not for a raid, but for a reckoning. The Norman King of England, William Rufus, had insulted him during negotiations over border tribute. Malcolm's pride, long restrained by his wife's counsel, finally broke. He gathered his men at Edinburgh and prepared to ride. Margaret, already ill and weakened by fasting, begged him to stay. She warned him that the omens were dark, that she had dreamt of blood and ruin. But Malcolm would not be dissuaded. He kissed her hand and said, "Pray for me, my dove. I will return before the feast of St. Andrew." It was the last time she saw him alive. V. The death at Alnwick. The campaign was brief and disastrous. Malcolm led his army into Northumbria, toward the stronghold of Alnwick. There, on the 13th of November, 1093, he was ambushed by Norman forces under Robert de Mowbray. The king and his eldest son, Edward, were both killed, struck down amid rain and mud, their banners trampled into the earth. When the survivors returned north, they carried only the news. Margaret's husband and heir were dead. At Dunfermline, she was confined to her bed, already weakened by illness. When the tidings reached her, she did not cry out. She only asked for the crucifix she had brought from Hungary, the same one she had prayed before since childhood. She held it to her lips and whispered, "Blessed be thou, Lord, who has given me this pain." 3 days later, she died. It was said that, at the hour of her death, a strange calm fell over the castle. The wind outside stilled, the candles burned steady, and a faint fragrance filled the room. Her confessor later swore that he saw light upon her face, as though her soul had taken its own dawn. 6th. The kingdom in chaos. Her death left Scotland adrift. Malcolm's brother, Donald Bain, seized the throne, expelling Margaret's remaining sons. The realm fractured, Norman influence rising in the south, Gaelic resistance in the north. For years, her children fought to reclaim what had been lost. In the end, it was David, her youngest, who restored peace, continuing his mother's reforms and expanding the monasteries she had founded. But for a time, the land she had tamed fell again into darkness, clan against clan, fire against fire. The queen who had prayed for peace died just as the kingdom she had civilized unraveled. 7. The long memory. And yet, her influence did not vanish. Even amid the chaos, her memory lingered, like the scent of incense after a mass. The monks she had patronized kept her story alive. They spoke of her kindness, her discipline, her quiet defiance against the coarser ways of men. They said she had turned the rough heart of Scotland toward God, not by fear, but by love. Within decades, tales of her sanctity spread. pilgrims visited her tomb at Dunfermline Abbey, claiming miracles of healing and peace. Her books, some said to bear the marks of Malcolm's rough fingers on their jeweled covers, became relics. And so began the slow transformation of Margaret the Queen into Saint Margaret of Scotland. Vive. The meaning of her reign. Margaret's life might seem uneventful beside the thunder of her age. No grand battles won, no empires forged, but her power was of another kind. She had taken a kingdom of iron and softened it with mercy. She had turned a warrior court into a place of learning, and she had shown that sanctity could dwell not in the cloister, but in the chaos of politics and family. Her reign marked a subtle turning point in Scottish history, from tribal rule to centralised monarchy, from isolated customs to continental connection. The abbeys she founded became centres of law and record. The reforms she began laid the foundation for a literate Christian kingdom. She did not conquer with armies, but with order, not through edicts, but through example. And that, perhaps, is why her legacy endured. When castles crumbled and kings were forgotten, Margaret had once dreamed of entering a convent. Instead, she made a kingdom, her cloister, a nation, her prayer. Through her, Scotland learned a quieter strength, the strength of patience, of charity, of faith that endures when swords fail. And even now, nearly 1,000 years later, her name still glows faintly in that northern air, carried by the winds that sweep the stones of Dunfermline. After Margaret's death in 1093, the kingdom she had so carefully steadied fell again into confusion. Her husband and eldest son lay slain, her younger children scattered or hiding. Her reforms, still fragile, faced the rough wind of rebellion. Scotland, for a time, reverted to the old ways. Donald Bain, brother to the late king, took the throne and expelled the English-speaking monks and clerics Margaret had gathered. Her courtly refinements, her rules of prayer, her Latin scholars, her customs of fasting were abandoned. In those first years, it seemed that her work would vanish with her. But Margaret's influence had planted itself too deeply in the minds of those she had taught. Her sons Edgar, Alexander, and David had been raised under her careful instruction. They knew her Latin prayers, her sense of justice, her faith in order over chaos. One by one, they would return to reclaim the crown, and in doing so, they would carry her memory like a quiet banner through the generations. The sons who remembered it, began with Edgar, her son, who deposed Donald Bain in 1097 with help from the Anglo-Normans. Edgar's reign was brief and mild. He rebuilt the abbey at Dunfermline, restored her clerics, and kept peace with England. He was not a great king, but he was a dutiful one, and perhaps that was precisely his mother's legacy: governance without vanity. Next came Alexander I, sterner and more independent. He had his father's iron and his mother's devotion. He fought rebellions, strengthened the church, and named his new foundation St. Andrews, the future spiritual heart of Scotland. But it was David I, the youngest and most thoughtful, who truly fulfilled his mother's vision. David had spent years in England, in the company of the Anglo-Norman court, absorbing their laws and customs. When he became king in 1124, he began transforming Scotland into a European kingdom, orderly, Christian, and 1124, literate. He founded monasteries across the land, Augustinian, Cistercian, Benedictine, each echoing the piety of his mother. Chroniclers would later call this transformation the Davidian Revolution. But its roots were unmistakably Margaret's. The saints and scholars who came north saw her influence everywhere: in the abbey libraries, in the altars dedicated to the Virgin, in the rhythms of royal charity. David did not merely honour her, he built her vision into stone, the making of a saint. For many years, Margaret was remembered simply as the good queen, pious, charitable, devout, but in the early 13th century, her name began to take on a different weight. Pilgrims visited her tomb at Dunfermline Abbey, where she had been buried beside her husband. They prayed for intercession for the sick, for children, for peace within families. And the stories began. A blind woman who touched her tomb claimed to see again. A storm at sea was said to calm when sailors cried her name. A poor man, dying of fever, was cured after drinking water that had been used to wash her tomb. Such stories spread through the monasteries, recorded in Latin hagiographies that read like soft chants. Queen Margaret, Mother of Kings, Consoler of the Poor, Star of the North. By 1249, her sanctity was undeniable in the eyes of both clergy and people. King Alexander II petitioned the Pope for her canonization. It was granted in 1250 by Pope Innocent IV. On June 19th of that year, her remains were solemnly translated, lifted from the old stone tomb, and carried in procession to a new shrine within Dunfermline Abbey. The bells of every church in Scotland were said to ring. The chronicler, John of Fordun, wrote that the land rejoiced as though she had been newly born to heaven. And so, Queen Margaret became Saint Margaret of Scotland, IV. The shrine at Dunfermline. Dunfermline Abbey became one of the holiest places in the realm. Pilgrims came from all across the north, peasants and nobles alike, to kneel at her shrine. The monks kept careful record of the offerings: candles, gold coins, embroidered cloths, and carved wooden crosses. Above her tomb stood a golden reliquary, decorated with jewels modest by continental standards, but precious to the Scots. It was said that the air around it always smelled faintly of myrrh and beeswax, even in the damp chill of winter. The abbey grew into a centre of pilgrimage and royal burial. Later, Kings Robert the Bruce among them would be buried there, believing that to rest near St. Margaret was to sleep in the company of grace. Her feast day, November 16th, was observed with fasting and prayer. Every queen who followed in Scotland was measured, in some quiet way, against her example. Even centuries later, chroniclers wrote of pious women by saying, "She lived as Saint Margaret lived." V. The Saint and the Nation. As the centuries passed, Margaret's sanctity merged with Scotland's own sense of itself. She became a symbol not just of faith, but of identity, a bridge between the Gaelic and Anglo-Norman worlds that had once seemed irreconcilable. Her children's descendants ruled Scotland and, eventually, England. Through dynastic unions, her blood would run through the veins of the Plantagenets, the Tudors, and even the Windsors of today. In medieval chronicles, she was described as Mother of the Nation. And though that phrase was meant spiritually, it became almost literal, her lineage winding through the history of Britain like a thread of gold. During times of war, especially in the Wars of Independence, her relics became a rallying point. Robert the Bruce himself prayed at her shrine before the Battle of Bannockburn. To him, she represented the soul of Scotland, pious yet fierce, gentle yet enduring. Her story was retold, not in the language of conquest, but of care. And perhaps that was her truest triumph, to shape a kingdom, not by might, but by memory. VI. The loss and the survival. But history, like the sea, never rests. In 1560, during the Scottish Reformation, Dunfermline Abbey was attacked. The relics of many saints were destroyed or dispersed, their shrines torn down as symbols of papist idolatry. St. Margaret's golden shrine was plundered, her bones hidden by monks before the mob arrived. For years, their whereabouts remained uncertain. Some said they were smuggled to Edinburgh, others to the continent. Eventually, a portion of her relics, a skull and several bones, were confirmed to have reached the Escorial Monastery in Spain, sent as gifts to King Philip II. Her presence, though scattered, endured. In 1673, Pope Clement X confirmed her as one of the patron saints of Scotland. Her feast day survived every political upheaval, kept quietly, even when the old church was outlawed. And in 1862, Pope Pius IX declared her Patroness of Scotland, restoring her name to public veneration. Zeven, the quiet legacy. Today, Dunfermline Abbey still stands part ruin, part parish church. Tourists walk the same stones that pilgrims once crossed barefoot. The air smells of dust, stone, and the faint echo of incense long gone. Her shrine is no longer golden, but her story remains engraved in every guide's voice. Here lay Margaret, queen and saint. She prayed for peace and taught her people to read, to fast, to forgive. Her name endures across Scotland in churches, hospitals, schools, and even the ferry that crosses the Firth of Forth, Queen Margaret. But beyond these monuments, her truer legacy is something quieter, an inheritance of gentleness. In an age defined by iron, she taught the virtue of patience. In a time of endless feuds, she built through faith and small deeds. And in a kingdom ruled by the sword, she proved that holiness could rule more deeply than fear. 8. A candle in the north. If you stand in the ruins of Dunfermline as evening falls, you can almost feel the weight of her centuries. The light filters through broken windows, catching on the moss-covered stones. It is easy, in that silence, to imagine her presence, the soft rustle of her veil, the turning of pages in prayer, the murmured Latin drifting through the dusk. St. Margaret's story is not one of miracles or battles, but of persistence of a woman who transformed a kingdom, one act of charity at a time. In the end, she reminds us that history is not built only by conquerors, but by those who quietly hold the light when everything else falls dark. And so, nearly 1,000 years later, her candle still burns steady, small, and eternal in the long night of Scottish memory. The pipe rolls were, in essence, England's first systematic financial records. They began under King Henry I in the early 12th century, though they became fully regularised under Henry II around 1155. Each year, the sheriffs of England, the kings, local representatives would submit detailed accounts of income and expenditure from their shires. These accounts were carefully written on parchment rolls, long sheets, stitched together and stored in the royal treasury. The rolls themselves, when coiled, resembled the shape of a barrel or pipe. The pipe rolls recorded everything: taxes collected, debts owed, fines paid, royal estates, even the costs of repairs to castles. It was an astonishing achievement for its time, an attempt to map the entire kingdom's financial life in writing. No one would call it exciting. There were no dramatic battles, no royal intrigues, no heroic knights. But its quiet, bureaucratic rigour would shape England for centuries. The mechanics of accounting. The process was meticulous. Sheriffs collected revenue from feudal dues, rents, tolls, and fines. They recorded every penny in their local accounts, noting both receipts and expenditures. Accounts were sent to the Exchequer, the King's Treasury, which was housed in Winchester and later London. Auditors examined the records, often calling sheriffs to explain discrepancies. Auditors carried specialized tools: tally sticks, thin pieces of wood notched to indicate amounts of money. One side represented what was owed, the other what had been paid. A cut or notch could tell an experienced clerk more than any spoken word. Every discrepancy was scrutinized, every debt recorded, every penny traced. The pipe rolls, in effect, turned England into a nation of paper trails long before the word bureaucracy existed. The daily life of a clerk. The men who created the pipe rolls, clerks, scribes, auditors, lived lives as meticulous as the records they produced. They wrote with quills sharpened each day, dipping into ink made of iron and vinegar. They copied entries line by line, often under the watchful eye of the barons of the Exchequer, whose job was to ensure accuracy. Mistakes could mean a clerk's dismissal, or worse, punishment for falsifying royal revenue. Their days were long. Parchment was expensive. Ink was precious. Errors could not be erased. Each strike of the quill was deliberate, final, and exacting. Yet, despite the tedium, their work mattered. These rolls became the backbone of royal authority. They allowed the king to know what he owned, what he was owed, and what he could spend, transforming governance from intuition to calculation. IV. Tracking the kingdom. The pipe rolls recorded both ordinary and extraordinary revenue. Taxes from towns, fines for market offences, tolls on bridges, fees for using royal mills, feudal dues, knights paying scutage instead of military service, land rents and inheritance taxes, fines for law-breaking, from petty theft to manslaughter, all contributing to royal coffers. Royal estates' maintenance of castles, forests and hunting grounds. Each shire became a small ledger, feeding into the larger record of the kingdom. The king could now make long-term plans, build a castle, repair a bridge, fund a campaign. The pipe rolls gave him information and leverage, an almost invisible form of power that extended further than armies could march. V. An example of daily use. Consider a small example from 1166. The Sheriff of Somerset reports £25 collected in fines for illegal fishing in the Royal River, £14 owed from land rents, still unpaid, £8 spent repairing the bridge at Bath. The auditors note discrepancies: £2 missing, £1 miscounted. They summon the sheriff, who explains that a flood had washed away part of the toll receipts. After discussion, the accounts are corrected, noted in the pipe roll, and stored in the treasury. This kind of small, repetitive accounting happened across every shire in England, a level of precision previously unknown in medieval governance. It was tedious, it was dull, but it worked. VI. The king, as accountant, Henry II, one of England's most energetic and organised kings, relied heavily on the pipe rolls. He would review the records personally, sometimes for hours each day, reading the summaries prepared by clerks. Chroniclers noted his fascination. The king knew not only who owed what, but how long they had delayed payment, and who had defrauded the crown. Henry used this knowledge to assert control over barons, merchants, and even bishops. Wars were funded through careful accounting rather than simple levies. Courts could demand repayment because records existed to prove a debt. The pipe rolls made administrative authority visible even when soldiers or nobles were absent. Number 7. A legacy of order. The pipe rolls, though seemingly mundane, left a permanent imprint on history. They standardized financial accountability in a way that no king before had attempted. They trained generations of clerks, auditors, and bureaucrats, creating a class of professional administrators. They preserved historical records, providing later historians with unmatched detail about medieval England taxes, land ownership, social structure, and even personal disputes. Without these rolls, historians would know far less about daily life in the 12th century. We would not see the debts owed by a widow in Lincolnshire, the fines paid by a thief in Dorset, or the wages for building a royal hall. The pipe rolls turned boring paperwork into the backbone of government, invisible but foundational. 8. The Quiet Revolution. It is tempting to overlook the pipe rolls. They are pages of numbers and names, chronicling money moving through the hands of sheriffs, barons, and peasants. But in that tedium lies a profound truth. History is often shaped not by wars or revolutions, but by records, order, and routine. The clatter of a scribe's quill, the notches on a tally stick, the neat columns of receipts, these mundane acts created the architecture of authority. England, once a chaotic patchwork of claims and feuds, could now be measured, monitored, and managed. And through that management, the king's power extended far beyond the